answer is very simple. That is, Boris Johnson was simply unable to moderate the worst aspects of his personality that meant that he consistently failed to meet the most basic standards required of the office of Prime Minister. And so really, if you look at his entire premiership from the very beginning, it was scandal-ridden, from proroguing Parliament illegally, which the Supreme Court found, to having parties in lockdown, to trying to defend and change the rules for corrupt colleagues of his, and finally to lying over a sex scandal, which ultimately brought him down. So I think really, if you look at the last 2.5 years, it's not particularly surprising that we find ourselves in this situation. But I think if we look at his resignation in the context of his whole premiership, I think it's actually perfectly consistent in the way that he's behaved. It was, as I say, the most extraordinary 48 hours that I've witnessed in British politics, where you had a record number of ministers resigning in a 24-hour period. I think ultimately it topped about 60 MPs. And still at that point last night, Boris Johnson was refusing to resign, which I think really just indicates his total contempt for the norms and the expectations required of a Prime Minister under the British Constitution. So I think really when historians look back at Boris Johnson's premiership, they'll see someone who did something, who sort of acted very differently, who had great ambitions, but ultimately fell well below what they want to achieve and also what others expected him to achieve as well.
And there's an interesting little splash of arrogance in what happened last night. After the 41st resignation, as I've seen it in the timeline, Boris Johnson sacked Michael Gove. That sacking is the sign of somebody in control. I think you've got the power to do something. A remarkable thing to have happened as well.
Absolutely, and I think that is what actually pushed so many who were remaining in the cabinet last night to actually resign and openly call for Boris Johnson to leave this morning. I mean, I think the fact that, he faced so many resignations and so many cabinet ministers directly told Boris Johnson to his face that he had to resign, but he managed to pick one person who he in fact sacked. I think shows that actually this was quite personal. And Boris Johnson and Michael Gove have a long rivalry that goes back several years. And I think really this was just the latest development in that, and probably the last major development between the two as major political rivals. But I think that's really what indicated to those in the cabinet and other Conservative colleagues of his that actually Boris Johnson was acting in a way that was really ultimately going to damage the Conservative Party. And that's really what forced so many to move this morning and ultimately forced a change in idea about his resignation from Boris Johnson.
Right, and that's a very important thing. Of course, with all the parties that have been going on in Number 10, there must have been lots of drinking straws around, but I was wondering what was the last straw to break the camel's back of this premiership, and there you have it, Michael Gove's sacking. The resignation speech, as could be described from this afternoon, was as well pretty remarkable. It was more an electioneering speech, I thought. Johnson saying it's clearly now the will of the parliamentary party for there to be a new Prime Minister. That, rather than, I realise it's time, awfully sorry chaps, it's time for me to go. Remarkable speech, wasn't it?
I completely agree with you, Andy. I think it was very specific and deliberate use of language, trying to basically deflect blame and also create distance between himself and his party, which I think really, if we look at the end of Donald Trump's presidency, when he was blaming everyone around him for not supporting him, it really has stark parallels between that. But I think also it also won't have done himself particularly many favours in the Conservative Party. The fact that the speech was completely without contrition or any kind of humility. And of course, he listed lots of the things that he considered to be the hallmark aspects of his legacy, mostly Brexit. But I think actually, when we look back at what actually happened under his premiership, yes, he did preside and push forward the UK from leaving the European Union, but actually the UK is still in a period of sort of instability in the sense that it's repatriated some powers from the EU, but it still doesn't know what it wants to do with that powers. And I think really Boris Johnson ultimately failed to set the UK in a sort of clear, ideologically consistent path towards a sort of Brexit future. And I think ultimately, if you pin your legacy on something like that, you actually have to have something more than simply you got it over the line. But I completely agree that the speech was a sort of fascinating insight into Boris Johnson's current mentality.
Absolutely, very strange. In the past few days, we've heard various other speeches, people distancing themselves. Notably, there was Sunak's speech in Parliament, resignation speech in Parliament the other day. Everyone, I imagine, in these days is positioning themselves for the future, for their personal future. How normal is this, one, and two, how detrimental is this to British politics in the long run?
Well, I think in terms of how normal it is, I think it's unusual in the sense that we've had a situation where you have a Prime Minister who's had so many regular scandals that really the Conservative Party had started to conclude that Boris Johnson's time was ultimately going to end before his term in office was due to end. And so I think that has basically forced or certainly encouraged cabinet colleagues and others in the Conservative Party to try to manoeuvre and position themselves to be in a position where they can be launching a leadership bid. I think, what we've seen over the last 48 hours has also been very indicative of what you said, that, ultimately looking after themselves and thinking about the future, as of course, all politicians do. But I think what we've seen is particularly cynical attempts to try to manoeuvre yourselves within the cabinet.
Right.
The fact that, certain MPs, you look at Greg Clark, who accepted a cabinet nomination even before Boris Johnson had resigned this morning. If you look at the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, the fact that he accepted this position really, to some extent, or at least to myself, shows kind of long-term political thinking in terms of themselves, rather than trying to ensure that in the short term the Conservative Party actually had some stability and trying to remove Boris Johnson from office. But I think in terms of looking to where the Conservative Party will go from here, I think it's quite obvious that the Conservative Party wants a period of stability, and it wants someone who is simply going to be much more stable and traditional than Boris Johnson. Because
Sure.
I think it's been hugely traumatic for the Conservative Party to find itself in a situation where it has this supposed vote winner, this person who they feel a debt to for winning so many seats, but who, frankly, because of their personality, was unable to maintain the reputation of the Conservative Party. So I think they're going to be looking towards a much more stable individual, and certainly there won't be, short of people who are looking for the job.
I'm sure Boris would like this comparison that I'm about to make, but he's a force of personality in much the same way that Margaret Thatcher was a force of personality. There the differences end, I'm sure. But after Thatcher, there came John Major, who was a very grey sort of character. Are the Conservatives going to play it conservative into the future and perhaps try and tone things down, as maybe almost suggested there? I'm not going to ask you to predict yet who's coming, because we're going to have months of looking at that, and I think it's too premature to do that. But in terms of the way that they'll be thinking, will they be looking for a safer way forward from now?
I think they certainly will be, and I mean, frankly, all they have to do to have a more stable period in office is, just not get themselves involved in very difficult scandals. So I think that will certainly help. But I think, we certainly just have to recognise the fact that the, context of the country, both economically and politically, is very, very difficult at the moment, particularly due to the cost of living crisis, where we have inflation over 10% and wages not rising by any amount that could possibly mitigate the rising cost of living. And I think really, that's a very, very difficult thing to deal with, certainly in the short term. If you want to help ease the cost of living crisis, essentially you just have to be giving lots of money away. And so I think that's going to present a particularly difficult challenge for fiscal conservatives with the Conservative Party, who want to promote a more, what they would consider to be a responsible sort of fiscal approach of trying to reduce the deficit, reduce the amount of spending. So I think really, we're in a period of about 18 months before the next election. And I think simply due to the circumstances in which they find themselves in, it's going to be incredibly difficult to try to maintain some kind of very stable time in government. I mean, even over the last month or so, we've seen sort of unprecedented strikes within the UK, which of course have disruption. And of course, we don't know what exactly will happen in terms of COVID, if there'll be further spikes, further variants. So I think they will certainly look to stability. Of course, what always happens when an unelected prime minister assumes office is increasing calls for their power to be sort of legitimised through a general election. And we saw Theresa May doing that. Even though she had a majority, she still was tempted by the fact that she needed to go for a general election. So I think, that's going to be very difficult to, heed those calls, particularly at the moment with the Conservative Party about 10% lower than the Labour Party. But potentially, a new Prime Minister that comes in will have some kind of so-called honeymoon period where they have a high level of popularity. So it's quite possible that I would say in the later stages of this year we could see a general election. But if that happens, then really all bets are off.
Well, that's obviously something to look forward to. But of course, today, there must be tremendous confusion, not just around the world, but especially in the UK, as to exactly what has happened. Because Boris Johnson, we're told, has resigned. We saw him giving this gung-ho resignation speech, as I've described it. And yet tomorrow he'll still be the Prime Minister because he decided to be. Doesn't that have to be given the support of the Cabinet, which of course is in disarray because it's changed so much in the last few hours or days, or the 1922 committee, which is the mysterious committee that's behind the Conservative Party? How can Mr. Johnson continue as Prime Minister having resigned? And how long will he continue to do so?
Well, it's an excellent question. Even those who study politics, all day, including myself, struggle to keep up with exactly what has happened today. And I think essentially what we've seen is that Boris Johnson unilaterally announced the terms of his departure, in that he only agreed to resign at the point in which a new leader has been elected. And so constitutionally, the Prime Minister is not required to resign until, a new leader of a political party has actually been selected. And so really, he's sort of at the discretion for that. But we've also seen sort of an open discussion within the Conservative Party about that issue, about whether Boris Johnson should actually be allowed to continue to remain as Prime Minister until the next leader is chosen. In terms of the process, I understand that the Conservative Party wishes to whittle down the selection of candidates to 2 people by the 21st of July, which is when Parliament goes on recess, which will then spark a 6-week period when the campaign will really kick off, and ultimately that will be for the Conservative Party members to resign. But I think, and apparently, that is a position that the interim cabinet that Boris Johnson is currently filling and appointing has agreed to, on the basis that Boris Johnson will not make any major policy decisions during this few months that he remains as Prime Minister. But I think actually the Conservative Party is going to find that this is a really difficult situation to put themselves in. So I think they to some extent think Boris Johnson is going to be, well behaved. They think that he's going to have not too much power, and I think they think that he's really going to just try to have a more decent end of his premiership. But actually, I see no reason to believe whatsoever that Boris Johnson is going to be better behaved in this period rather than the rest of his premiership. I mean, to some extent, once the Conservative leadership election timetable election has begun, Boris Johnson will be untouchable in the sense that the timetable won't be able to be changed. If there are any more scandals, which frankly I'm sure there will be, happen, they won't be able to remove him. And so actually we may see Boris Johnson emboldened in this period. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see the way the Conservative Party responds to that. I think that the final point on this that I would make is that actually this presents a very interesting opportunity for the Labour Party to try to inflict maximum damage on the Conservative Party, because actually they are able to submit a motion of no confidence in this period, which may even happen as soon as Monday. And if that happens, they're going to force the Conservative Party to publicly vote on whether they have confidence in Boris Johnson. And either they do, in which it's humiliating for the Conservative Party to have to do that, having just forced them to resign, or if they don't, we may see ourselves in an early general election. So I think the fact that they've allowed Boris Johnson to remain Prime Minister in this period could end up causing them a lot of regrets.
Well, and it's very important to remember that that vote of no confidence is different from the vote of no confidence that happened a month ago, which we've been assured can't be repeated for a year. This is a government, the full parliamentary vote, so very different from what we saw before. So,
absolutely, it's a different mechanism.
So all these different mechanisms, and you mentioned that they might hope that there wouldn't be any more scandals, and yet, and yet today, just hours after the resignation speech, there was another scandal, wasn't there? And not about a leaving party either, about a wedding party. How is this going to change things?
Yes, absolutely extraordinary. Within a few hours of announcing that he would be leaving, but remaining, as we mentioned, as Prime Minister, the Mirror newspaper broke the story that Boris Johnson and Carrie Johnson, his wife, planned a huge wedding celebration for the Chequers residency, during the summer, which supposedly, according to insiders, was one of the main reasons why he actually wanted to remain as Prime Minister during this period. And of course, it's completely inappropriate because it's using state assets and state facilities for essentially private purposes. But of course, that's something that we've seen Boris Johnson do throughout his premiership. And there's, I think, really been a dangerous blurring between party and state, but of course in this situation it's between individual and state. So I think that's the first scandal that's happened within a few hours. But there's actually another scandal that's happened when he was in the Parliamentary Liaison Committee being scrutinised yesterday. He was asked about whether he'd met a former KGB agent in Italy, which he confirmed, and he was asked whether he had told officials about this, as he'd be required to do. He would be required to do that as Foreign Secretary, which he confirmed that he did. And it's actually been found today that there is no record whatsoever of Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary meeting this KGB agent. So I think that is two quite serious scandals that's taken place, within this last 24-hour period. And so actually we think, well, 6 weeks or 2 months is not a particularly long time for Boris Johnson to remain in office. In Boris Johnson years, you can fit a lot of scandals into that. So I think this certainly won't be the last of that we see.
Well, yes, certainly tense times. The headline writers will have lots of fodder to play with, as they have already. And as you say, tremendous opportunity for the opposition parties. Also, yesterday, the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party saying that Boris Johnson's reticence to resign makes him the poster boy for the independence movement. I'm sure that this continuation of the situation, dragging into the autumn as may happen, will give even more strength to the independence proponents.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think there's one narrative that the Scottish National Party tries to tap in most of all, and that is this idea of the Scottish people basically being overruled by central government. And I think the fact that you have, the second Prime Minister in the period of 5 years, who will be basically not selected by the electorate, but in fact chosen by Conservative Party members, will just reinforce that concept that the Scottish people are not getting a say in who their Prime Minister is. Mm-hmm. And even if they do get a say in a general election, it's still perfectly possible that in Scotland the Conservative Party wasn't able to win any seats there, but in fact they still have a Conservative majority government in the UK. And so I think actually it's correct in the sense that this will only encourage that movement. But I think it's perfectly possible that if we do get a general election, if we get a change in government, if the Labour Party comes in, we could see a difference in tone for that. I think partly because at the moment it looks like the Labour Party is not going to be able to win enough support to govern on its own. It won't get a majority, which means that it will be dependent upon other parties, most likely the Liberal Democrats, but also may do a deal with the Scottish National Party. And if we see that, of course, that'll be the first time, I think in living memory that the Scottish National Party will actually have a say in the national government. So I think it's perfectly possible that we could see a change in the situation. But at the moment, it's certainly looking like we're on a trajectory towards another Scottish independence referendum.
Right. But having said that, I mean, I'm a great supporter of a United Kingdom. It's something I'm very familiar with and feel comfortable with, but we understand others have different feelings there. Well, but one of the interesting things about the British as a whole is the way that national events draw them together. We just recently had the Queen's Jubilee and the support given to the National Health Service during the pandemic was another sign of how people are coming together. Of course, the events of the last week, I imagine, had a similar effect. And even, I have to throw this in at the end of our conversation, even from Downing Street, seeing Larry, the number 10 cat, has been even on national television in the UK getting a front seat. How with Larry and with the general conversations, how has this affected the mood of the country?
Well, I think it's incredibly divided, to be honest. I think, really the divisions that we're currently seeing are a manifestation of what really began with the Brexit referendum in 2015, 2016, which of course was headed by Boris Johnson. And I think, that of course caused a pretty much direct split in the country, 48 to 52%. But it also caused a split in the country between metropolitan areas, which wanted to remain in the EU, and rural areas, which tended to vote to leave. So I think there are fractures on those lines, but also there are fractures in terms of, as you mentioned, what really brings the Union together. And you had 2 out of the 4 nations, Scotland and Northern Ireland, voted to remain in the EU. And so, the fact that we have such a massive constitutional change that has affected the fabric of the economy and society in the UK, that has essentially been forced on, 2 out of the 4 main regions, I think is really something that's very, very difficult to repair. Right. And particularly when you have someone like Boris Johnson, who really, didn't try to govern as some kind of unifier. After he won the 2019 election and he won such a large majority, he didn't actually bring, a broad swathe of people from his party into government. It was mainly just so-called Brexiteers. I think so. Really, what we've seen is just sort of triumph of Brexiteers at the expense of everyone else. So I think it's really quite difficult to see at the moment how those heels can begin to be those wounds can be healed at this stage. But I think potentially as we look towards other Brexit options, if we look towards sort of a more closer trading relationship with the EU, for example, if we try to negotiate perhaps an entry into the single market, then you could see some of those compromises that could bring the nation together. But we're certainly a long way away from it, and I think general elections when all these divisions come out. So certainly I expect to see a lot more divisions, a lot more fighting, unfortunately, before we hopefully come together as a United Kingdom again.
Well.